Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into one of the most dramatic intellectual battles in economic history. Before Friedman shook the foundations, one school of thought reigned supreme: Keynesianism. But here's the question: what happens when the people in charge of steering the economy don't actually know where the road is going? After World War II, the world was desperate for stability, so it turned to a new kind of economic playbook. This was Keynesian economics, named after British economist John Maynard Keynes. And it wasn't just a theory, it became the guiding philosophy behind how governments managed economies for decades. At the heart of Keynesian thinking was a simple idea: when times are tough, governments should spend money to boost demand. When the economy overheats, they should pull back. Think of it like thermostat economics: turn up the heat in a cold room, cool it down when it's too hot. So Western governments, especially the United States, got busy. Fiscal stimulus became their favorite tool. Big spending programs, tax cuts, public works, all designed to smooth out the ups and downs of the business cycle. But it didn't stop there. The government also tried to manage the rhythm of the entire economy. Recessions? Spend your way out. Booms? Raise taxes or cut spending to slow things down. It was economic micromanagement, and policymakers were eager to play conductor. Meanwhile, central banks, especially the Federal Reserve, focused on interest rates. Their goal? Full employment. If unemployment ticked up, they'd lower rates to stimulate borrowing and hiring. If inflation started creeping in, they'd raise rates to cool things off. It was like driving a car with one foot on the gas and the other on the brake, hoping the timing would always be just right. For a while, it seemed to work. Growth was steady. Employment was high. The post-war boom gave rise to a sense of confidence that the business cycle could be tamed with the right combination of tax tweaks and rate cuts. But behind the curtain, something was brewing. The question was never whether governments could steer the economy, but what if they couldn't see the whole map? What if their tools distorted more than they fixed? That's where our story turns next. Now, while Keynesianism was dominating the global economic stage, something very different was taking shape, quietly, in the halls of the University of Chicago. This was the birthplace of a revolution in thought, one that would challenge not just the tools of Keynesian policy, but the very philosophy behind it. Welcome to the rise of the Chicago School. At its core, the Chicago School was about skepticism of government planning, skepticism of central banks knowing best, and most of all, skepticism of the idea that you could control a complex economy from the top down like a machine. These economists weren't just theorists. They were data-driven, sharp-edged thinkers who demanded real-world evidence. They prized empirical rigor, meaning if your theory didn't hold up under the weight of data, it didn't matter how elegant it sounded. And they believed deeply in liberty. Economic freedom, they argued, wasn't just a moral good, it produced better outcomes. When individuals make choices based on their own incentives, without top-down interference, markets coordinate those decisions more efficiently than any central planner could dream of. And then came the shot across the bow, Milton Friedman's now famous declaration: inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It was a bold claim. Friedman was saying that all the complicated models about wages, expectations, and fiscal stimulus were missing the point. If you print too much money, prices will rise. Period. It wasn't about aggregate demand or wage spirals, it was about the money supply, plain and simple. But the brilliance of the Chicago School wasn't just in attacking Keynesianism, it was in offering a new foundation. Instead of thinking in terms of government spending and aggregate demand, they zoomed in. They asked, what motivates individual behavior? What incentives shape decisions? What happens when millions of decentralized actors respond to price signals, profits, and opportunity? They didn't trust models that relied on the assumptions of perfect information or heroic bureaucrats. They trusted markets, imperfect, yes, but powerful, adaptive, and rooted in human action. And while the mainstream still clung to Keynes, the seeds of a new economic worldview had been planted. Soon, those seeds would grow, fueled by crisis. The 1970s were supposed to be the era of smooth economic sailing. After all, governments had their Keynesian toolkits. Central banks had their interest rate knobs. Everything was under control, until it wasn't. This is where the economic story takes a turn, from theory to turbulence. And that turbulence came with a name: stagflation. Now, let's pause for a second. Stagflation sounds like economic gibberish, but it's actually one of the most brutal combos an economy can face: high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. According to traditional Keynesian theory, that wasn't supposed to happen. It was like rain and fire falling from the sky at once. The models didn't account for it. And when your models can't explain reality, that's a problem. The old Keynesian playbook, stimulate demand to reduce unemployment, just poured gasoline on the inflation fire. But if you tried to cool inflation with higher interest rates and less spending, unemployment got worse. Policymakers were stuck. And the public? They were paying the price at the gas pump, in the grocery store, and on their pink slips at work. This is where Milton Friedman stepped in again, not with a shrug, but with a "I told you so." For years, he had warned that excessive growth in the money supply, pushed by central banks trying to support government spending and full employment, was the real culprit behind inflation. And now, with prices soaring and Keynesian logic failing, more and more people started listening. Friedman's monetarist explanation gained ground. He argued that inflation didn't come from wage demands or consumer confidence, it came from printing too much money. Period. End of sentence. But there was more. The crisis revealed a deeper problem, a causal chain of distortions. Loose monetary policy didn't just lead to higher prices. It distorted the signals that markets rely on. Interest rates no longer reflected true supply and demand for credit. Investment decisions became skewed. Resources flowed into bubbles instead of productivity. And worst of all, public trust in economic stewardship began to erode. The inflation crisis wasn't just a bump in the road, it was a wrecking ball for the Keynesian consensus. And in the wreckage, new ideas rose to power. Theory is one thing, power is another, and by the late 1970s and early 80s, two political leaders stood ready to put Friedman's ideas to the ultimate test, not in textbooks, but in the real world. Enter Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the United States. Both leaders came to power during moments of deep economic crisis. Inflation was rampant, growth was stagnant, public confidence was crumbling, and both were willing to break from decades of orthodoxy to try something radically different. They embraced monetarist principles. That meant tight control over the money supply, cutting back government spending, lowering taxes, and, perhaps most importantly, rolling back regulation. The goal? To restore faith in markets and re-anchor expectations around sound money and limited intervention. But in the United States, this shift came with a jolt, a monetary shock of historic proportions. Under Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, the Fed launched a brutal campaign against inflation. Interest rates were raised dramatically. At one point, the federal funds rate hit nearly 20%. That's not a typo. 20. The results were immediate and painful. Businesses couldn't borrow. Mortgages became unaffordable. Unemployment shot up. A deep recession set in. For many, it felt like the medicine was worse than the disease. But the long-term effects, they were undeniable. Inflation collapsed. The economy eventually rebounded, and the credibility of the central bank was restored. It was a textbook demonstration of Friedman's warning: to control inflation, you must control the money supply. And Volcker did, at great cost. This was economics with consequences. Real consequences. Jobs were lost. Factories closed. Families struggled. But the grip of inflation was broken. The era of easy money was over, or so it seemed. And the world had just witnessed what happens when bold ideas leap off the page and into policy. Now here's where the story gets complicated. The war on inflation had been won, but in the process, something else had been created. A new kind of central bank power. Quiet, technical, and enormous. After Volcker's success, central banks weren't just trusted to respond to economic problems. They were expected to prevent them. The markets, the media, and governments began to treat central bankers like oracles, wise, data-driven, and above all, in control. But here's the twist. That new trust came with a price. To maintain economic stability, central banks began experimenting with increasingly complex policies. From the 90s onward, they didn't just tweak interest rates, they used tools like quantitative easing, forward guidance, and balance sheet expansion. These were untested waters, and the deeper they waded, the more influence they had over financial markets. That meant market signals, like interest rates, asset prices, and credit flows, became less about supply and demand, and more about policy forecasts. Investors weren't asking, is this a good business? They were asking, what will the Fed do next? This shift created moral hazard. When markets believe the central bank will always step in to rescue them, whether it's after a bubble, a bank collapse, or a bad quarter, they take bigger risks. And when those risks go wrong, the fallout doesn't just hit Wall Street, it hits pensions, housing, wages, and the middle class. So while the Chicago School had warned about inflation from too much money, a new challenge was forming: fragility from too much intervention. What began as a campaign to restore discipline slowly evolved into a system where central banks were expected to manage everything: growth, inflation, employment, even financial panic. But can any institution, no matter how smart or well-intentioned, manage an economy of hundreds of millions of people? Or are we just building a taller and more fragile tower, waiting for the next gust of wind? So if central planning even by central banks, leads to distortion, fragility, and moral hazard. What's the alternative? Well, before we handed the keys to central banks, there were decentralized monetary systems, and they're making a comeback in some surprising ways. Let's start with the gold standard. For much of modern history, national currencies were tied to gold, a physical asset that couldn't be printed at will. That limitation was the point. It forced governments to live within their means. You couldn't run massive deficits or inflate your way out of trouble, because your currency had to be backed by something real. Under a gold standard, money wasn't just paper, it was a claim on value. And while it wasn't perfect, it introduced discipline. Markets, not committees, constrained reckless policy. Then there's free banking. In the 1800s, especially in places like Scotland, banks issued their own currencies, backed by reserves and held accountable by competition. If a bank overissued notes, it lost trust and customers. If it managed its reserves wisely, it thrived. No central authority was needed. Stability came not from control, but from reputation, transparency, and market feedback. Sound chaotic? Maybe, but chaos can be more self-correcting than command. Fast forward to today, we're seeing the rise of cryptocurrencies, digital, decentralized, and borderless. Unlike fiat currencies, many cryptos like Bitcoin have fixed supply rules. No central bank, no printing press, just code, transparency, and distributed trust. Now, whether crypto will become a dominant form of money is still up for debate. But what it represents is clear: a hunger for alternatives, for systems where no single authority can manipulate the rules. These systems, gold, free banking, crypto, they all share a core idea: money should emerge from markets, not be dictated from the top down. Because when money reflects real value, when it's guided by voluntary exchange instead of political incentives, it can serve not just as a medium of exchange, but as a check on power. In a world dominated by central banks, these decentralized models offer a different path, one where trust is earned, not enforced. By now, it's clear that Milton Friedman didn't just change economics, he reshaped global policy. His ideas echoed far beyond the lecture halls of Chicago. From Chile to China, from Eastern Europe to Wall Street, his emphasis on free markets, individual choice, and limited government found eager listeners, especially in nations trying to escape the wreckage of central planning or state control. In places like Chile, Friedman's ideas were adopted under authoritarian regimes. Economic liberalization, privatization, and monetary restraint were introduced with brutal political repression in the background. That contradiction sparked intense debate. Can an idea that champions liberty survive when implemented by force? Friedman argued yes. He believed that economic freedom often paves the way for political freedom, that giving people the ability to own, choose, and transact freely builds the foundations for civil liberties. But critics pointed out the danger. What happens when markets are free but people are not? Is liberty still liberty when it's enforced by a boot? This is the moral dimension of Friedman's legacy. On one hand, his work empowered millions, pushing back against inflation, restoring faith in price signals, and proving that markets can coordinate human needs without coercion. On the other hand, the technical tools he introduced, monetary targeting, floating exchange rates, deregulation, were often adopted by institutions with very different moral frameworks. And when those tools were used without guardrails, without transparency, without ethics, they sometimes produced chaos. It raises a deeper question. Can good economic policy exist without good moral foundations? If freedom is reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet, does it lose its soul? The Chicago School warned about the failures of central planning, but history reminds us that markets, too, can be twisted when separated from accountability, community, or conscience. Friedman's ideas were powerful, transformative, but like all powerful tools, their impact depends on who wields them and why. So, after this journey through ideas, inflation, institutions, and ideology, what are we left with? 3 lasting lessons, and they matter now more than ever. First, central planning has limits. Whether it's Keynesian fiscal management or aggressive central banking, the economy is simply too complex, too dynamic, and too human to be steered like a ship. No model can predict every outcome. No expert can foresee every ripple. History shows us that well-meaning interventions often come with unintended consequences, and once you build a system that relies on constant oversight, you also build a system vulnerable to error, bias, and political influence. Second, markets need moral grounding. Freedom isn't just a technical condition, it's an ethical one. Economic liberty without integrity leads to exploitation. Deregulation without responsibility breeds collapse. When we forget the human dimension, when we treat people like data points and systems like machines, we lose sight of why free markets matter in the first place. It's not efficiency for its own sake, it's dignity, choice, and agency. And third, liberty still matters, not as a slogan, but as a framework. The Chicago School didn't just offer a new set of tools, it offered a new way of thinking, one that trusts individuals over institutions, prices over policies, incentives over commands. It asked, what happens when people are left to trade, build, invest, and grow without being nudged at every turn? That question isn't just academic, it's personal, and it's still being answered every day, in boardrooms, in classrooms, and in central bank meetings around the world. So as we look ahead, maybe the real challenge isn't choosing between government and market, but remembering that both serve best when they serve us, not the other way around. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you learned something new or found a fresh perspective in today's video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you enjoy exploring the deeper forces behind economic change, political power, and historical turning points, check out our other videos. There's always more to uncover beneath the surface.